Great. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. A very, very welcome to you all, and on behalf of all the WGH co founders and members. It gives me an immense pleasure to open the plenary today for marking 1 year of working of Women in Global Health India chapter. I'm super excited about completing a year of working and for achieving all the work that we did in this last year despite the pandemic. But what I'm even more excited about is that the leaders, the champions taking the cause of gender equality in global health and global health leadership forward have joined us today for the opening. And they've joined us from across the world. No words can express our gratitude to our esteemed guests today. Friends, while women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, women have also shown unprecedented levels of resilience and leadership in managing the crisis. In attempt to advocate and influence the key policy decisions to include the voices from the ground, WGHI conducted a 5-part dialogue series on amplifying the contributions and challenges of different cadres of frontline health workers during COVID. These dialogues not only showcased the commitment and leadership of rare to find women community leaders at national level, but they've also bridged their conversations with the potential policymakers, something that's been missing from the mainstream public health conversations and decision making for a long time. Navigating through the pandemic response has re emphasized the centrality of political commitment of countries to develop and implement equitable health policies and gender equality in health care leadership. As WGH India is entering the second year of working, we commit to take this cause forward and advocate more aggressively to the need for ensuring that global health leadership is gender balanced. What better occasion than this could be to discuss the need, the urgency, and the strategies for garnering political attention around the issue of creating opportunities for the inclusion and representation of women in healthcare leadership and policy spaces. It's a privilege to be joined by the gender equality champions to discuss the issue of making gender equality in global health leadership a political agenda. Our speakers need no introductions, but I'll still take a few minutes to tell you a bit about them. We'll start with hearing from Dr. Poonam Khitapal Singh, the WHO Regional Director for Southeast Asia. Dr. Singh has devoted more than 3 decades to strengthening public health as a leader and manager at national and international levels. We're joined by Professor Ilona Kikbush, who's again needing no introductions here. She's the founding director and chair of Global Health Center at Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. She's known throughout the world for her strong commitment to the empowerment of women. We're truly honored to have Professor Sarah Hawkes joining us today. She's the director at the Center for Gender and Global Health at University College London. She's the director of the Global Health 50/50 initiative, an initiative to advance action and accountability for gender equality in global health. Privileged to have Ms. Geeta Rao Gupta joining us too. She is the senior advisor at United Nations Foundation, the 3D program for girls and women, co-impact, a global philanthropic collaborative focusing on gender equality and women's leadership. And she chairs the advisory board for Women Lift Health, an initiative to promote women's leadership in global health. We're also joined by Professor Madhukar Pai, who again needs no introduction, and he's a Canada Chair of Epidemiology and Global Health at McGill University, where he serves as an Associate Director of McGill International Tuberculosis Center. He's not only written and spoken widely about the need for more diverse, inclusive, and gender balanced leadership roles in global health, but has also been a role model in creating this change through his own work. We're joined by our very own Dr. Rupa Dutt, who's the Executive Director for Women in Global Health. She's the central driving force for the WGH movement, advocating for gender equality in global health and correcting the gender imbalances in global health leadership. Her determination to build WGH movement to transform women leadership in health has inspired many. Once again, thank you all for joining us. And Rupa, I'll pass it on to you to tell us a bit more about our participants, to tell a bit to our participants more about our journey of WGH. So the session will flow like we'll start with hearing from Dr. Poonam Singh, followed by specific questions to our panelists, and then a panel discussion on the strategies. We'll then open it for question and answers from the audience. And this will be followed by a second session on the WGA chapter journey. All your questions can be posted in the chat box, and we'll be taking them at the end of the session. Rupa, over to you.
Thank you, Samega. I'm going to briefly in Hindi say, मुझे आज बहुत खुशी है, मैं सब आपके साथ हूँ, नवे साल की मुबारक. I just greetings to everyone, saying I'm very happy to be here with all of you, and really a happy new year to all of you with this annual year for Women in Global Health India, and especially want to acknowledge the leadership of Samega, Deepika, Sapna, Preeti, many of who I've been having conversations, and to see that all of you have launched in a pandemic year just shows how strong and vibrant the leadership of women in India and Southeast Asia are. So this is just, exactly what we are harnessing here at the Women in Global Health Movement, is that all of you have the true power and leadership. And so when we talk about Women in Global Health Movement, we truly are really talking about women's leadership from all different backgrounds, from all different societies, from all around the world. Last year, Women in Global Health had 14 chapters, and this past year we have grown to having over 24 chapters all around the world. And we continue to have interest from another additional 15 chapters, just showing you that this is the time that while COVID-19 is showing the inequalities that have existed, and they're widening inequalities, especially for women, women from all around the world are eager to mobilize. They're eager to catalyze change. They want to come together and use their collective voices to drive the social change. And India particularly, we're really thrilled to know that last year you were one of the most active chapters, having put together 11 different power dialogues on COVID-19, bringing together voices of women that are considered often the invisible women in health, together with policymakers. And I was very thrilled to be able to say just this past week, we hosted an event where we launched our largest initiative ever, called the Gender Equal Health and Care Workforce Initiative, together with the World Health Organization and the government of France. And we were joined by one of the Women in Global Health members, Sindhu, who represents ASHAs in a union, and really advocating for the harsh realities that we know that exist. We know half of what women do in the health sector remains unpaid in the informal sector. We also know that women are continuing to face a lot of violence, especially during this pandemic. It's even higher numbers, as many of my colleagues will talk more about some of those points. But we know that India is bringing its voice to the table. There is exciting times to see India's leadership in the global space, as it's a country that is growing in influence and power, but also really demanding for much more equity. We know that India's involvement in issues around getting vaccine equity has been another critical, important aspect. And there's a lot more to be done, but particularly Women in Global Health, we use the model of really being a movement, and really making sure that all of you can use Women in Global Health as a platform for voice and platform for change. We launched last year our 5-year strategy plan, which is focused on one, mobilizing and really mobilizing together chapters from all around the world using a flat leadership model. Second, we are really using a pillar of advocate for change, where all of our chapters, as they are mobilized, and the individuals that support and participate the movement, to really activate them to start advocating for the issues that matter the most for gender equality for all women in global health. And then 3, really garnering commitments. We want to make sure that in all of the sort of recognition of inequalities and the voices that we're hearing from women and others that are recognizing the gender inequalities really leads to true change. So our next pillar is very much about garnering commitments, and commitments for institutional change. Too often, the conversation stops at fixing women. We're here to fix systems. We're here to reduce and end structural barriers that keep women out of leadership roles at all levels. And finally, to hold leaders accountable. Using the Women in Global Health platform again is the means to go ahead and track what is happening, where is progress, and to be able to use that collective voice together in the Women in Global Health movement. And as a result of this, we are aspiring over the next 5 years to really have tangible outcomes and impact. And for us, that means really making sure, especially women from the Global South, are getting an opportunity to make decisions in global health. We know that women from all around the world need opportunities to set the global health agenda. In COVID-19, we did a review of women's representation and gender equality in COVID-19 task teams, taking a look at over 115 task teams from 87 countries. 85% of those were majority men, less than 5% were women. So we know this is a universal challenge, but particularly we are committed to supporting our chapters in lower middle income countries and really in the next 5 years, making sure that we see a shift in women's representation from Global South. My colleague here on the panel will be talking about some data that their group is collecting on particularly women's representation from Global South and global health institutions. We know that currently women from LMIC countries represent, again, less than 5% of women on global health institution boards and CEO roles. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And then particularly looking at institutional change and really making sure we end the unpaid work and really give women the choice and opportunities to enter into the formal workforce so that they can be counted and they can get the rights that they so deserve that they're not getting in the health and social sector. And then particularly also looking at the issues of violence. We know that the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is in the process of ratifying its Convention 190 on ending all forms of violence and harassment. And this is a convention we want all of our chapters to get behind and really ask their governments to ratify it and make sure that both in informal and formal workplaces, there's no form of harassment and violence for all genders. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of the type of things that Women in Global Health is planning for 2021. And we're really, again, proud of what the Women in Global Health Chapter India has done in a pandemic year. We together in the global community are calling for a new social contract for all women working in the health and social sector. And we look forward to working with all of you. Back to you, Samega.
Thanks, Rupa. Thanks for getting our attention back to the institutional change and fixing the systems and not the women. I'll just take a little moment to share with you the message from Dr. Singh, and then we'll start our discussion. Can we please play the message from Dr. Poonam Singh?
It is a pleasure to address you today to mark the 1-year anniversary of this commendable initiative. Achieving equal representation of women in decision-making roles in health, as other fields, is required for us to attain the gender-equal region and world to which we are committed. Gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but also a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world, a truth that is central to Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender, but which nevertheless permeates all other SDGs, including SDG 3 on health. Growing evidence highlights the strengths that women leaders bring to organizations, communities, and countries they lead, which are also reflected in the many public health achievements that women have led and contributed to, something I have observed over my own long career. When women lead, organizations change. Women leaders tend to create more democratic, participatory, and collegial work cultures, inspire collaborative and cooperative approaches, promote the sharing of credit for achievements, and provide alternative role models. And yet, despite women accounting for around 70% of the global health workforce, they do not occupy a corresponding share of leadership roles. Strengthening women's leadership is especially needed amid the COVID-19 crisis. We know that men are dying at greater rates from COVID-19, but at the same time, a growing body of evidence suggests that women and girls are bearing the brunt of the pandemic in ways that could jeopardize decades of progress on gender equality. This is why WHO has highlighted the critical importance of integrating gender into all aspects of COVID-19 response, with a focus on 6 key asks for health leaders and policymakers to adopt and implement. First, when recording cases of COVID-19, collect both age and sex disaggregated data. Such data will help inform the development of gender-sensitive policies, which are critical to advancing overall health equity, the focus of this year's World Health Day. Second, prevent and respond to domestic violence. Throughout the pandemic, women and girls have experienced increased violence at home, especially during lockdowns. WHO continues to urge all health sector stakeholders in the region to take a leading role in addressing gender-based violence, including by maintaining and adequately resourcing appropriate health and social support services. Third, we call on governments to promote access to sexual and reproductive health services. Throughout the response, WHO has provided critical supports to all countries in the region to maintain essential health services with specific emphasis on sexual and reproductive health. Since 2014, accelerating reductions in maternal mortality has been a flagship priority, and we are very much determined to sustain and accelerate the world-beating gains we have made. Fourth, we urge health leaders to protect and support all health workers, approximately 70% of whom are women. WHO continues to support member states to protect health workers from infection, to prioritize them in vaccination, and to prevent discrimination, stress, and burnout. Fifth, we ask leaders to provide equitable access to testing and treatment for COVID-19. The biggest challenge countries are currently tackling is to roll out COVID-19 vaccination as equitably and efficiently as possible. To succeed, they must engage trusted women-led organizations that can promote community buy-in and help identify and overcome gender-related barriers to vaccine access. Sixth, all duty bearers must ensure that response strategies are both inclusive and non-discriminatory. This means combating the stigma associated with COVID-19 and ensuring respectful care for all. It also means applying proportionate social and public health measures that reflect local epidemiology. We must grasp the opportunity to drive real change and build a fairer, healthier, new normal that outlives the current crisis. And we have much to build on. Although countries in South Asia started with a low base, they have registered the fastest gains in closing the gender gap in the last decade, especially in health and survival. Across the region, women play a vital role in health from the community level up. In India, Ashas and women's self-help groups foster community engagement and mobilize the demand for health. In Bangladesh, women actively contribute to the work of community health clinics. Women have had a significant impact on pandemic response interventions in Indonesia, Thailand, and Timor-Leste. 2 of the region's 11 health ministers are women, by no means a new development. But women in the region continue to face challenges that can limit them from rising to the top. Insecure and unprotected livelihoods, the gender skills, wage and poverty gaps, women's double work burdens, and the insecurity, violence, and social discrimination that pervade the lives of women and girls. These are all impediments to women's leadership in global health. And they all stem from inequality. In the region I head, women's empowerment continues to be a priority within WHO and in the strategic approach we take to health issues. You can be certain of our ongoing leadership, advocacy, and support, both in the region and globally. I congratulate Women in Global Health India on your 1-year anniversary and appreciate the opportunity to be part of your celebrations. WHO looks forward to continuing to collaborate with all partners and stakeholders to create a gender equal region and world that achieves sustainable, inclusive, and equitable health and development for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Our sincere thanks for your warm wishes, your motivating words, and also sharing those extremely relevant asks with us and setting the tone for our discussion today. I'm just going to jump right into the questions to our panelists, building on these ideas. And my first question regarding the urgency and the relevance for pushing the gender equality agenda to a political agenda goes to Geeta. Geeta, we've just heard Rupa saying how 85% of the national COVID task forces in COVID been led by majority men. What do you think we've lost by marginalizing women in the pandemic leadership?
Thank you, Sumega, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. First and foremost, congratulations on this 1-year anniversary. I remember when you began, I had briefly talked to all of you. So want to take a moment to specifically mention you, Deepika, Saluja, Sapna Kedia, and Preeti John for being pioneers in India and setting this up. It was long needed. So thank you for that and for being so active in a COVID year. Yes, you're right that on national task forces, the data shows through that study that was in the British Medical Journal that women are not represented equally. In fact, they're there in very small numbers, but perhaps more disappointing to me because I do serve in an advisory capacity to WHO, was to see that even the global task forces didn't have equal representation of women, that the IHR emergency committees that were set up for COVID actually had a representation of women that ranged between 1/4 to 1/3, which was disappointing. So what is missed is essentially 2 things in my mind. One is that you miss out on the talent that exists in half the sort of any country's population or the world's population. There is much more talent out there, and when you leave out women, you miss out on that talent. And second, and related to that, is that you then miss out on a different perspective of the realities of everyday living, right? Because women and men have different roles and responsibilities in society, their experiences are very different. And so their perspectives, the perspectives that they can bring to the decision-making table are often distinctive. And so when you leave women out, you lose out on that perspective. So it's not difficult to understand, therefore, why many of these issues that the regional director of WHO talked about, which were not brought to the fore the initial, when the pandemic first hit, such as women's higher income and job loss, the expanded and unpaid burden of care that they had to take on, the gendered poverty rates, the domestic violence increases, and most particularly, direct sort of impact was that maternal and reproductive health services were not considered essential services in the pandemic, which had enormous health impacts and disadvantaged girls and women in a big way. So, that's what you lose out on. It sort of creates that exclusion at the decision-making table, creates a vicious cycle, because then you lose out on the issues that are most relevant for women. When you don't meet women's needs and miss those, then you are sort of exacerbating the gender inequalities in society. And when you exacerbate those gender inequalities, you have fewer women at the leadership table. So it's a vicious cycle that gets perpetuated. We now know that not having the diversity at the leadership, at the decision-making table has consequences. So why keep replicating a model that we know that is broken, right? I know in the face of epidemics, I saw this in Ebola as well. It's often, there's a rush to act, and they feel that, this kind of quick response makes it difficult to keep everything in mind, every single factor in mind, which then argues for the fact that our health systems, our decision-making within global and national health systems should always be equal, not just in the face of a crisis. So what we're looking for is more representation. But I think the point to also emphasize, Sumega, is that it's not just more women, but it's a new type of leadership. It's a new model of leadership that we want to sort of make sure now is valued, right? So the typical traditional male model of leadership we are seeing may not be as effective. So if it is true that there is a new model of leadership, we want to make it possible for women to be rewarded for that style of leadership. I've seen in a lot of organizations, particularly global organizations, women do rise to lead positions of leadership, but then they're forced to adopt the same male model of leadership. They're rewarded for that. And that doesn't add any value, because then their realities and their perspectives don't gain prominence in the discourse within global health. So let me stop there and say there's a lot to be done. And I'm glad that you're working at it in India. Thank you.
Thanks, Geeta. Thanks for your wishes and bringing to the fore the two important issues of talent and different perspective. We just had a Twitter chat yesterday, and we asked this question on not having women on the decision-making tables. What is it that we are missing? And some wonderful responses. I remember a few talking about how women bring to the table their own experience of vulnerabilities and marginalization, and which kind of helps in making global health policies more effective. But I'll underscore your point on the different kind of leadership, which is not copying the male, aggressive, pretty oriented towards measurements and so on. And also the vicious cycles, and that builds on to the next question, which I'm going to ask to Sarah, talking about how this is a vicious cycle, not having women on the leadership, not having policies which are more responsive to the gender needs. And as we all see during the pandemic and beyond, that all these factors are, this issue of gender inequalities in global health and the resultant unequal policies is multifactorial. So I want to hear from you, Sarah, on how can we operationalize an intersectional approach to gender and leadership in healthcare? Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sumega. And please let me echo Geeta and I'm sure all of your other participants and panelists in just really congratulating you. I can't believe actually how far you've come since we first met about a year and a half ago. Just the incredible things that you've managed to achieve in what a terribly, terribly challenging environment to be able to do it in. So many congratulations and happy first birthday. So it's a very good question. How can we achieve intersectional leadership in global health? And I think coming from the Global Health 50-50 side, we would certainly say one of the very first things we need to be able to do is to be able to measure what it is that we treasure. So in other words, to be able to actually monitor whether or not we are making progress to the kinds of goals that we're all setting ourselves and the kind of world that we want to achieve. So I'm just going to speak from the perspective of what we've looked at within Global Health 50/50, and then sort of pass that over for reflection. So in Global Health 50/50, which is an advocacy and accountability mechanism within the global health sector, I think what very much echoing what you said and what Geeta said, and I think what Dr. Singh referred to as well. We do, of course, see a link between what the makeup of the sector looks like and who and what the sector, the global health sector, prioritizes as recipients of action. So we do think that there is a link between at the bottom line, who's in a leadership position and how decisions are made in terms of, for example, the gender responsiveness of policies and programs that the organization or the sector seeks to deliver. So it's not just a case of organizational intersectionality being a standalone issue. We think that at a conceptual and at a measurement level, that actually does bear a link to the priorities of the global health sector as a whole in terms of who benefits from the resources and the activities of the sector. So that in and of itself becomes a very strong rationale in our framework as to why we need to see intersectional leadership, because then you have a diversity of views and visions and opinions about what it is as a sector, as a health sector, we should be delivering on. And as you may know, what we have found, certainly what we found last year is in our annual report, is a complete lack of diversity in global health leadership. So we see a sector that is predominantly dominated by men, is dominated by men from certain nationalities, i.e. nationalities that are predominantly Northern Europe and North America, and is dominated by people who have been educated within the same very small collection of elite universities, which again kind of leads to a stasis, we think, in terms of how the sector thinks about what it is that we're all trying to do and achieve. So how do you change that? I would say that one of the things that we've learned from looking at organizations over many years is that you can't change organizations without changing society. That it would be almost impossible to think of a truly intersectional, equitable and equal organization without also thinking of a truly equal, equitable and intersectional society. Because at the bottom line, for example, one of the biggest barriers that we see to women's progression, equality of progression throughout their careers, is the additional domestic work that women have to do. The childcare, I mean, COVID has clearly put all of this discourse back on the table, a discourse that has certainly been in operation for centuries and probably millennia, and has been certainly part of the feminist ideology and discussion, at least since the 1960s. But COVID has really thrown a very strong lens and strong light onto the absolute inequalities that exist in the domestic sphere in terms of both domestic work and childcare, that cannot possibly be unaddressed if we also then expect to see women having an equal opportunity in the paid labour workforce. So, you know, how do we achieve intersectional leadership? Personally, I think that there's probably two ways of thinking about it. One is that we cannot, as I said, we cannot de-link that from a much wider struggle for equality across society. The second thing that I would really strongly put on the table at this point in time is that thinking that all that we need is intersectional leadership is possibly the wrong lens of thinking about how organizations operate. What we should be really calling for is intersectional collective bargaining and intersectional collective action throughout an organization. Because at the end of the day, the outcome measure of the leadership is a reflection of, you know, an entire career pathway. And just focusing on what the leadership is up to is, you know, it's measurable, but that arises because you have strong bargaining power, strong policies of worker protection, strong equity, strong intersectionality across all of the career pathways for everybody in that organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's too much for me to absorb in such little time. And I was simultaneously thinking of the action points. But thank you for underscoring the link between the leaderships and the policies. And I particularly like the emphasis on diversity and not just aiming for intersectional leadership, but intersectional collective bargaining and action. I see a lot of merit in there. And rightly said, it's just a reflection of our society, what we see in our organizations and so on. Moving from there, I think we can just take a pause in terms of the polls that we have to see here. How many in our, okay, the top leadership position in our organization, while others can respond to this, I'll just move on to build on these points that have been discussed so far in terms of exclusions, linkages between policies and people's and the leadership positions and the policies resulting from there, collective action and no change in the organizational setup till we don't push the change at the societal level. But while we talk about these questions and everything, we know all these discussions go back to patriarchal norms and the inequalities in society and the traditional roles and so on. But when we start talking about actions, we often hear from organizations and even in our circles when we devise our policies to say, oh, we can't go change the society, or we can now go, in Indian context, change the caste system, or we can't go, change the patriarchal norms, or we can't change what's happening in a domestic sphere. So let's focus on something more tangible or easier to achieve in the same language as, these inequalities are reproduced. Going back to what organizations collectively can achieve and what we in our individual spheres and in our societies and communities can achieve, I'll now reach out to Ilona, who's been, the drivers of the global health. Okay, that's pretty surprising. Actually not. So the top leadership position in the organization from our participants, 38% has been led by men and 63% by women. Pretty impressive. Ilona, this comes back to you. So you've been the drivers of the global health movement, Women in Global Health Movement, and the board, and supported the establishment of the first chapter. What are your reflections on the growth of the movement, and where do you think our priorities lie in the context of what has been discussed so far, and how can we achieve, or at least build a direction towards achieving these? Over to you, Lorna.
Thank you, Sumega, and namaste to everyone, and congratulations, of course. Not everyone might know that I grew up in India, So I'm particularly happy to be at this meeting. I was due to be in India several times last year. Obviously, it didn't work. So I thought I'd wear my Indian earrings and my Kashmiri shawl for this event. So to answer your question, I think what the rapid growth of women in health, women in global health shows that there's a real need out there, a real need for women to want to get organized and to do things together to affect change. You've indicated that in everything that you've said. And, you know, sometimes it just needs a small starting fire to then really get things going. And what was the most gratifying thing for me when I raised some of the issues that have been discussed here, that it was really an enormous group of young women that said, you know, we want to take that forward. And Rupa has described this in such a great way. I'm also happy it's developed that way, because for me, still too many of the present proposals to strengthen women and some of the debates around women's leadership are very, very individualized. And I personally think what it needs is a strong movement that is built on solidarity and on equity. And that means solidarity with other women, with women in other countries, you know, no matter which way we look around the globe, and with others that are left behind. And that's why, you know, on the one hand, the women's solidarity agenda must always also be an equity agenda. And, you know, I am very aware of this because when we started, you know, the women's health movement, it was very much a world that was thinking in binary terms, for example. And the world is no longer binary, and we have learned that. And that is such an important development, and it's been expressed by many of you in terms of the diversity. But we've also learned that there are inequalities within our own country, wherever we are, that need to be addressed. And the racial inequalities and the decolonization global health movement is one expression of that, where we need to be working together. So I belong to a generation that really organized as a social movement. And we were very proud to call ourselves feminists, and I still am. And, you know, feminism is about personal, social, economic, and political equality. And it is this equality issue that, of course, reflects then as feminist politics throughout society, is what we're looking for. And for me, it is first and foremost an issue of rights. And this call for rights also has to be reflected in a certain amount of radicalism. And, you know, for me, when I think back how radical, for example, the first women's health movement was, some of you might know about this publication, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which really brought together, you know, this notion how our health is related to the health of societies, is very, very important. And if we look at larger policy agendas now, I'm thinking of some of the countries that are talking about feminist foreign policy, for example, you know, to say what is the expression of feminist foreign policy. In my mind, feminist foreign policy would stand definitely against vaccine nationalism, for example. So, you know, how is in everything we do and whatever political sphere we are active in, how is that notion of solidarity, of equity, and of rights reflected? And so, you know, this feminist approach, of course, is an agenda not just for women. It's an agenda for the whole of society. And it's not just about having more power, and some of you already alluded to that. It's about a new understanding of power. It's a new understanding of leadership, a much more democratic way of organizing organizations and society and movements. And that's also why I'm quite excited that, for example, in the whole area of economics, a new generation of women is starting to define, how we should approach economics in our society. What are these models? I'm thinking, of your own Jaite Ghosh, who is thinking about this. We've had Esther Duplo, we have Kate Rayworth, we have Mariana Mazzucato. We will now have Dr. Ngozi at the World Trade Organization. We're starting to have women head economic agencies, be the chief economic officers in big financial organizations. We have, of course, the women prime ministers who seem to have handled COVID-19 on average a bit better than some of the men. But I think it is this, applying this feminist perspective of a different leadership and a different society to all areas of society. And I think now, as we think forward in terms of building forward better, I think these economic voices that see economy in a very different way. And I'm really happy that WHO has announced this WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, which will be led by Mariana Mazzucato and will clearly have that political agenda. So I'll end just on saying, how thrilled I was that your title said this is a political agenda, that it's a broad agenda that leads to more equity, to more solidarity, and therefore a very integrative understanding of health. That's about the future of women, the future of society, and the future of the planet. And for that, I think, we have models now from women for a very creative agenda and how to do things differently. And I hope, with health in mind, we will move that forward. Thank you, Sumega.
Thank you, Lona. I love the colors that you're wearing, and thanks for the wishes to Sarah too and to you. Again, it's again very difficult for me to absorb such insightful thoughts, and I'm still absorbing. But totally agree. I think this agenda, in terms of a political agenda, is certainly beyond a very narrow, focused, reduced idea of just having women in the leadership roles and fixing the immediate organizational changes. It is about solidarity with other women. It's about pushing for equity. And thanks for bringing in the decolonizing global health agenda as well, which is very much linked to, the male power, the male dominance in global health, and we are all victims of that in many sense, and it has kind of even captured our imagination of how policies should be made and implemented. Uh, Taking forward your idea of the feminist approach and the agenda for the whole of the system, and not just, this feminist approach calling for equity is not just relevant to women but also for men, and beyond, as you rightly said, just the human health but also the health of the planet. Wonderful thoughts there for us to ponder, and I'll just move to Madhu with with those ideas. Madhu, your reflections on this feminist agenda in terms of serving to men as well, and what role do you feel? You've been a great champion of men allyship and men leaning out. Um, what would you add to this discussion in terms of the role of the man? Oh.
Thank you, Sumika, and congratulations on year one. I think it's very apt and appropriate that India does more of this work, because we've all been very polite here, but what's happening in India is scary. India remains a deeply patriarchal society, as it was when I lived there for 30 years. And the rising tide of authoritarianism is very linked to patriarchy, and the oppression and arrests of women activists, women journalists, their harassment is beyond scary. So there is simply no doubt that many, many more people need to be involved in this effort. And I honestly would love to see more men at the table discussing these issues. Even this meeting, I can barely see men at this meeting. Every meeting I attend to, it's mostly women who already know a lot, who understand all these issues, don't need to be convinced. But I don't see men participate. In the same vein, when I attend meetings on decolonizing global health, it's mostly Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are talking about this. I don't see white people at this discussion. I don't see white people at many discussions on racism and global health or in medicine. And I'm worried. I mean, where are the men? Where are the white people? Why are the same set of people talking about issues that they already know or been talking about for decades? It makes me very nervous that we are in this small bubble and we keep talking about issues that we already know very well, but we're not really touching the key people who are really driving the agenda. I think Ilona and others mentioned it. This rising tide of authoritarianism sweeping the world is mostly all men, and they are failing us at every stage, whether it's climate crisis, whether it's the pandemic response. Their approach is just leading humanity down a very dangerous path. And it's the women who are calling this out in every country. It's the women who are fighting and organizing and trying to bring some sanity to this madness. Men are absolutely failing. And how do we call this out when the society itself is so deeply authoritarianism, patriarchal, and imbalanced? So global health to me is reflective of what is happening in the society, which is what Sarah said. And I think every aspect of global health is dominated by men, dominated by mostly white folks, and mostly from high income countries. That is the brutal reality that global health 50-50 and every single study we've ever done has shown with stunning clarity. We're not here to debate that, but to change that, since men corner pretty much all the real estate, I and many others are talking about the need for them to kind of open up the space. It's not enough to just say women need to lean in. Men have to get out, and that is true at the political leadership. That's true within global health. They have to vacate the space and open the space for a change to happen. Now, when I wrote that piece on why men in global health need to lean out, and I put that link in the chat box, women tweeted it and responded to it. Hardly any men did. I was watching. I was hoping that more men will back me up there, and they didn't. Maybe I'm just being too optimistic. But how many sessions have you seen on male allyship? I've only seen one so far. And why do I get called all the time? When Sumeka asked me, honestly, I tried everything possible not to attend the session. Not because I didn't think it was important. I wanted to see other male allies. I wanted to see Indian male allies at this meeting talking about this, because we are still like a small fringe group of the same set of people talking the same damn issues again and again and again. Where are more Indian male allies? Why are they not standing up to role model for others? You turn on the Indian television, it's all male panels. Everywhere it's the same damn thing. You're just not changing anything here. So I just want to say that we shouldn't be again and again talking about what the problem statement is. We know it. We need to bring more white people, more males into this conversation and get them to role model what change they can actually meaningfully do at a personal level and at their institutional level. Now, at a personal level, as I wrote in my blog post, it is not hard for men to lean out. It is not hard. It is more than doable, especially established men who have a wall covered with awards, who have won every possible accolade, who are at the pinnacle of their privilege and career. It takes them no effort to lean out. I promise you, it is bloody easy to lean out. They can create space overnight if they wanted to, but they're not doing it. They're not. They are going after more and more power, more and more privilege. They are so damn reluctant to lean out. Especially older white men, absolutely can lean out thousandfold higher than what they're doing now. They're not doing it. They're not. And so now I don't know what to tell you, because at an individual level, it's possible to lean out. It's not happening. At an institutional level, it's a nightmare, because institutions are dominated by men who are very reluctant to give up their power and privilege, and power will fight back. Even in my own institution, it has been such a struggle here. I don't have a single indigenous colleague in my school. I do not have a single Black professor, a colleague of mine in my school. I tried to recruit an indigenous professor 2 times and I failed. So it is, I'm very despondent about the institutional change. At an individual level, I can tell you that it's possible. Men can do more, men should do more, men are not doing so, but they can. How do we change these political and institutional structures that continue to privilege a small set of men who are holding power and want more power? To me, these are the defining challenges. I still think these conversations are happening in small silos, mostly among women, mostly among BIPOC women. I want to see this broken out of this small thing and become a more of a mainstream issue. And I definitely want to see more allies, and I want to see more male allies, and I want to see more male allies in India. So next time, I should not be the one speaking. I would love to see more Indian men come and talk about exactly what they are doing and what they should be doing to inspire other men to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhu. Thank you. And just for everyone, I really had a tough time convincing Madhu to be on this panel, but we really needed to hear this. And totally agree, and very valid points in terms of what changes can men do at the individual level and at the institutional level. And there's widely known facts about the institutional changes being too difficult. And related to this, what I would also want to put on table is that personally I've seen many feminist men in their personal spaces, but when it talks about championing feminism outside, I've never seen them active. They might hold very dearly the feminist principles to them in their personal lives, in their families, and even in their communities, but I've not even seen them fighting for a first cousin on those issues. So there's something that we need to handle at a more structural level than at the individual level to even enable men to realize this. And we'll talk more about this in terms of in the next session, where we'll actually talk about strategies, and I would love to hear more from you there. But as you rightly said, so these discussions are happening in a closed circle, among people who are already aware, and I'm just going to test this up in terms of how aware our participants are. Do we need to actually have the same kind of participation for our future sessions, or should we be targeting a new audience, or probably the student community, or another kind of assuming they're not aware and probably taking it there. But moving next to the action points and the strategies, and I know we're running behind time. I'll quickly move to the session talking about the concrete strategies, and we'll quickly take reflections from how do we move from here? How do we collectively push the agenda of gender equality in global health leadership to be a political agenda, not just at the political party level, but at the government's agenda and the agenda of different actors who are involved in the global health governance today. I'll go back to Geeta to start sharing her thoughts, and then we'll follow the same order. Geeta, over to you.
Thanks, Sumega, and thanks to all the fellow panelists for all the very important points each of you made. I'm glad that the question and the discussion has sort of evolved into a focus on the fact that this is actually a political issue. And I want to say to Madhu, I sense your anger and bitterness and pessimism, but have to say that having been in the fight for gender equality for more than almost 4 decades, to give my age away here, I will tell you that what really works is organizing and mobilizing, is when you recognize that gender inequalities are structural and inherent in the way institutions are built, and that the only shifts that occur because of movements, because of mobilizing. And it's the success we've had so far in gender equality, the progress we've made, has been primarily because of grassroots women's movements and their organizing and the collective bargaining that Sarah talked about. So just to say that that's where it has to go to. And I have great hope in that, Madhu, just because I can see, as you can see from, the young women who have made this happen in 1 year's time, that getting together and organizing, even on the margins of their existing jobs, right? This is not what they do full time. Rupa's leadership, everybody is now citing these statistics that we didn't know even 5 years ago. So I think that the combination of political mobilization and advocacy by the people who care. So I agree that initially it's just us, it's the same old people, right? But that's good to build solidarity. That's good to be able to mobilize. And that's when you begin to see some action. And then that has to be bolstered with the data, with the evidence, to the extent that that matters. Partly it's the evidence, there's the head and the heart issue, right? So partly it's the evidence, but for the most part, it's the anger is good, the emotion is good. And I think the combination, when I've seen the greatest success is when those get combined in the right way. And when we recognize that just training women or even changing a few institutions is not going to be sufficient, but you need it happening at all levels. I think you need action at all levels. You need top down, you need bottom up, you need non-traditional champions, you need the traditional champions. And so that's been my experience, that of course we know there's some measures that work. We know, for example, now diversity training is not the magic bullet that we thought it was. It doesn't necessarily work at all. It may go the opposite direction. We know that the quota system, having targets and fixed numbers of who should be represented works. We know within organizations, the recruitment policies and that work. We know the workplace policies that allow for that pipeline for leadership that Sarah talked about. So we know a lot of what needs to be done. I think the rest is political, and it is going to require a movement. It's going to require us organizing better, which will mean having more forums like this to strategize. So I think these individual national chapters of Women in Global Health is the best thing we can do. And together with all of the other initiatives, Women Lift Health and many of the others that are simultaneously in Global Health 50-50, now Co-Impact, the other philanthropy I'm working for now is going to be supporting women's leadership. When all of those partners that function in this ecosystem actually work together, which is my dream, that if we can all work together, then we'll begin to see the push that needs to happen. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Geeta. I'll just pass it to Sarah, and then we'll and please feel free, everyone, to come in, the panelists. Just unmute yourself. Yeah.
It's hard to follow Geeta and say anything beyond saying just ditto. I completely agree with everything that Geeta has said, and the anger and the passion that everybody has brought to the panel. On a very practical level, in terms of what we have seen might make a difference, contextually realizing that not everything works in the same way everywhere. I very much agree with Geeta's notion that or framework that what we need is action that is both top down and bottom up. And I think that within the health sector, we have seen that not just in terms of as a positive way of that change happens, not just in terms of leadership and the career structures within an organization, but also in terms of getting an issue paid attention to within the health sector more broadly. The huge success of some of the women's health movements and the huge success of the HIV movement, for example, have been combinations of both top-down and bottom-up demand. And I think it's that bottom-up demand that has been somewhat missing from some of the debate and discussion and some of the evidence up till now, and certainly, you know, hands up from the perspective of Global Health 50/50 in terms of what we're able to measure. Being able to actually go out and measure bottom-up demand, for example, is something that has really eluded us up till now. And if anybody's got any ideas about how we could move forward with that would be, we'd be very welcoming of that as a discussion. I think one of the things that I would say, just sort of having looked broadly across the sector, the global health sector, is that one of the things that I would caution against is the notion that gender equality is not linked to the struggles for all other equalities. And I think that's the intersectional issue that is being addressed. But, you know, there is a danger of the kind of atomization of, we're doing decolonization today, we're doing feminism tomorrow, we're doing disability awareness 2 weeks down the line. These are, I think, all at their root, the struggle for equality. And so, yes, we definitely have allies who are not women, i.e. men, but we also have allies across the broader struggles for equality. And I think learning from those other struggles is also an important way that we can look more outward for the allies and the methods of struggle. I think just sort of going back again at a very practical level in terms of some of the issues that Geeta touched on for the organisations that we're all embedded within. You know, there are policies and practices that are either written in law or are gold standard best practices that we should be holding our own organisations to account for. I mean, one of the things that we look at in GH 50/50 is organisational policy environments. And we see, I mean, you know, it always pains me to say this politically and philosophically, but we see much more focus on having good policies in some parts of the global health sector compared to others. Now, how that translates into organisational practice is obviously a different question, but there are some very key parts of the sector that are still very much lacking good policies. And the painful part is to say that it's very frequently the NGO sector that hasn't got its policy house in order. And if you don't have a good organisational set of policies, really difficult to then, for any of us, to hold an organisation to account. So I'm just going to stop there.
Did you want me to come in, Sumika? Yeah. Well, you know, I think first of all, I'm fully in support, as I also tried to say, that, you know, this is incredibly political. And I think in some cases it's been not looked at enough of being political. And once you really get political, you get you know, you get opposition. There is no question. You can't get change without a fight, to put it quite simply. And you can't get change without taking risks. And definitely I can say, you know, looking back a little bit like Geeta, a couple of decades, you know, we didn't have any philanthropy around to support us. You know, we were out there in the streets, and it's you know, maybe it needs something like that again, you know, maybe and I don't quite agree with Madhu that it's always the same people. If I look, for example, who's joined the Women in Global Health chapter in Germany, this is loads of women who were never involved in this kind of stuff. And what I obviously try to do when then, I get invited on some panel, I just pass it on, that it's one of those 300 fantastic women that have joined the chapter. Also, I think, it's a question of how can we build on what has been achieved. And I think, for example, the attempts that Dr. Tedros has made at the WHO, I wrote it in the chat, to get a more equitable representation of women in senior positions. And you well know that one of his most senior women is from India, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, an absolutely extraordinary woman. And I'd like to tell you another story of something that would never have happened 5 years ago. About a week or two ago, a Swiss newspaper had a headline, and that headline said, "Grandmother appointed as head of the World Trade Organization." And, many of us spoke up, etc., but some people went ahead, and it led to a letter to the newspapers that had run this headline of about 125 ambassadors and heads of organizations from Geneva to these publishers to say, this is just not on. So we have to keep pushing that, these voices come from all parts of society, from people who have different levels of power. And, I relate very much, given my own history, to some of Madhu's frustrations, because, that's one of the reasons I started that Twitter list and a couple of years ago, because, here I was having come to WHO as a young woman and non-medic, and, being the only one in the room, and, having a range of quite interesting experiences, etc. And then, I say, hey guys, this is 30 years later, and there's still all men on this panel, very simply put. And I said, they're out there, let's make them visible. And so I think, and this I think reflects what Geeta and what Sarah have said, there isn't a single area in our lives where we mustn't be political and push people on this agenda, and push them further and further and further, and call them out and hold them accountable. And I think one really important thing that has happened over the last years is having those data, the kind of data that Rupa and her group collect, the kind of data that 50/50 collects, etc. Because otherwise, people always said, well, there's a woman over there, kind of thing. And now, we can say, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I also think, point one, we must celebrate more what has been achieved. I mentioned all those economists, women economists in key organizations, and we must challenge them. Are they just women representing the same old economics? Or are they women who bring that creativity and that other vision of society? And I think that's part of our role now. Now that there are more women in senior positions with influence, let's challenge those women. Let's see, we all admire Angela Merkel, but there are less women in German parliament than when Angela Merkel first took office 16 years ago. So, something's not coming together. And so I think those are the kinds of things we must do, and we must challenge women as well. Women who have made it into the corridors of power must be solidaric with other women and must have a different vision of society and power.
Can I just jump in on that point, Sumega, if I may? So Ilona, you make a very important point with that example of Angela Merkel. And just want to say that in the past, what's worked well for the women's movement is an inside-outside strategy. That phrase where when you're in a leadership position in a traditional setup, it's sometimes difficult, even if you're a woman, to make the changes that are necessary. But if you partner sort of behind the scenes with a movement that from the outside is putting pressure on the whole system, you enable the woman leader to make the changes that she always wanted to make but couldn't on her own. So there is solidarity even between those who are in power and those who are on the outside if we strategically work together. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to make that point that sometimes
No,
it's
that's so central. You know, many innovators in organizations actually wish for that push from the outside. They
yes,
want the radicals outside so they can reform on the inside. One must
exactly.
never underestimate that. And that's also been critical in a number of areas of work in WHO, most definitely.
And
I, I,
if I can, oh, go ahead, Geeta, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say very quickly that one of the things that really pleases me is that when the women's movement began, and most of our work, even on the research side, gathering evidence, was to make the case to male leaders who were in policymaking positions to change policies in this way or that way for women. And now we've come to a point we've said, just move over, give us the leadership position. We've always known what to do. Let's just do it. I love that shift in emphasis that has occurred. And I just wanted to celebrate that.
It's great to chime in on this celebratory aspect. And I think, just a message to everyone tuning in from the chapter, this is exactly how Women in Global Health is operating. We particularly put the pressure both internally and outside. And this is where there is the ability to really work in collective action. And a lot of the points that, really just every time I'm, with Geeta, Alona, Sarah, Madhu, I just am learning so much about how to think about these things. But what I want to really turn to is that all of you are already thinking and taking action and operating this way. We know that there are individual factors. We know they're interpersonal. I think the points that you were saying, Madhu, and, Samega, you chimed in too, as being myself an immigrant that migrated from India and, spent 15, 20 years of my life arguing with my parents that it was okay for me to date. And now to hear my father go and tell his generation of men, it's fine, your daughter should be able to marry whoever, look at my daughter, how happy she is. That's an example of interpersonal change, and it doesn't happen easy. It has been personally, it is, you take risk in your family. In conservative cultures, you take risks with your colleagues. You can be labeled as the person that is the troublemaker. As being a physician myself, I've often embraced the troublemaker label itself. And that point that Sapna made in the chat about, we have to almost embrace the fact of, like, when we challenge people, that we are in a way, putting them into a difficult position and putting ourselves into a difficult position, because change is not easy, and power is not easily transformed. It sometimes does require to be taken, and really that's where this aspect of collective action, Lona, you have shared so many stories with me in the past about the women's movements at different points in history, and Geeta, hearing yours now too, about those different points where it's not just linear, it's not just the one time that you've passed one policy or one set of human rights, but it's the constant pressure that needs to continue. And I think that's really where using that ecological approach, saying that yes, individual and interpersonal is great, but we need to keep pushing the institutional and the societal policy change as well. And use the name of Women in Global Health or any other community that you're part of, because social movements are what drive the social change. And that's one of the best things I think that this global movement has been able to do, is that people can use our name to call out things and yet not face the personal individual retaliation. And we achieve more together, and there's so much to be done. So Samega, again, back to you.
Thanks, Rupa. I'll just quickly, using my opportunity to be the moderator, to add that totally we must build on what exists and be the change, and be adding to Rupa's point on using the solidarity and advocacy bit. We must also be very conscious of not replicating the same kind of inequalities when we are one of the global health actors or the influential actors. So we're very conscious of giving space to the front lines, to the women who deserve these voices, to the ideas where exactly they're coming from, and also bridging those links. And to Ilona's point, and personal and institutional, and just flagging again, personal is political. If it affects us, it must be on a political agenda. The change has to come from making it to be in a political agenda. We might face resistance, we might face many hurdles, but the path to change is to push it to political agenda. Madhu, before we hear you, there's another question, if you can also address that. So the question to you is it realistic to expect men to lean out? In theory, yes, but in reality, probably not. What are the alternatives? Women can be competitive enough to win against them, change systemic incentives to push women in like quota systems, which seems to have mixed results. How to make WGH or decolonizing global health movements more attractive to them? Over to you, Madhu.
So I'll begin by saying that this whole decolonizing global health, as many of you have been noticing, is really catching fire, mostly in high-income countries, right? There probably isn't a school in North America or Europe that hasn't already organized a webinar or a conference or something like that. And for whatever reason, I get invited like every week I get an invitation to speak. So what I've done doing now, and I've done it in, I think, the last 15 invitations that I've received, I hit the reply button and I say, look, while I have given such talks and written about it, I'm worried that this conversation is primarily being led by privileged people in the global north. That if you really want a successful conference on decolonizing global health, you need to center it on indigenous populations, indigenous scholars in high income countries, or Black indigenous people of color from the global south. That is where the real knowledge really comes from. And then I say that this is now very possible given the pandemic we are living in. Everybody is online and able to call in from wherever in the world. And then I say, here are the names of 17 people, which is currently on my list. I've created my own personal list of scholars on indigenous BIPOC folks who are really deeply thinking about decoloniality. And I've listed them, I've given links to their articles and their talks and their email address, and I attach it, and mostly all of them are women of color. And I send it to them. And you know what? Many people respond to me and say, thank you so much. We didn't really realize this. Thank you for giving us a list. We've already invited somebody from your list. This absolutely works. Now, along the same lines, wouldn't it be nice to have a list of male allies in global health? So that when you contacted me, Sumega, to speak, and I said no, I could have given you that list. In fact, you should have had that list yourself, right? I shouldn't be the one giving you a list of male allies in global health. You should have your list of 20, 50 people. It's not the same Madhu, it's not the same Gitin Ji, it's not the same Jeremy Ferrard that you invite. You invite many more people on that list. How do we create this? So here I want to share this tension that I have, which is unresolved in my mind. Maybe some of you have thought a lot about this and can answer this. It's like when in my global health class, I had a whole workshop by Stephanie Nixon, a wonderful white woman from University of Toronto, on privilege, oppression, anti-racism. She did a remarkable 2-hour session. And you know what hit me a lot when she finished the session? Here was a white woman talking about racism, okay? And the reception she got was outstanding. And then at the end, Stephanie got to me and says, Madhu, you know who my audience is right now? Other white people. I'm not interested in talking to BIPOC people because they know everything. I have learned from them. But I want to reach other white people on what racism and whiteness really means. I'm researching whiteness. I want to understand this better. They are my real audience. Along the same lines, I think we need men to say, here is how problematic the world is, why men really need to do way more than what they're doing right now. Just as white people have to have conversations about racism because they invented racism for their benefit. They must be involved in dismantling it. I'm not saying that organizing from the ground and demanding power to give up power is unimportant. I'm also saying people in power need to have their own wake-up moment where they understand how bloody ridiculously privileged they are as a male, as a white person, and then find a way on how their personal growth needs to happen and how they can bring about organizational change as well. I don't want to make this an either or discussion. I'm saying both need to happen. BIPOC people and women organizing has been happening for centuries. We need to see white people and men more actively involved in dismantling the patriarchy and the racism structures that they have invented for their benefit. How to make this happen, how to get more male allies into this conversation is something I think we all should be discussing. But right now, what I'm seeing is completely inadequate, in my opinion.
Thanks, Madhu. That's really important to bring on. And I'll not go into summarizing, but in the interest of time, we can still take 2 questions from the audience. And if you all can just be here for another 5-7 minutes, we'll just close by 10 minutes. Similar to the question on above, the question is, what are implementable strategies to convince organizations led by men to also prioritize gender equity within their organizations? If unification with other equity movements is emphasized early on, is there a risk of organizations thinking you're asking for too much and ignoring most asks? Sarah, would you like to take that, or anyone else who's worked with or studying organizations and the organization change? I'll repeat. It says, what are the implement? Sorry, yeah, Sarah, you got it.
Yeah, I mean, just a really quick response about, and it's partly about how we frame these arguments. And I would so addressing this as somebody working inside an organization, I would very much encourage other people working inside organizations, which I assume most people on this call actually work for an organization rather than for themselves. It's about demanding your rights. It's not about sort of asking for some kind of discretionary benevolence from the top. It's about actually knowing what your rights are. And most of us, I'm imagining, actually work within countries that, for example, have laws and have a very strong legislative framework that underpins non-discrimination, for example, that underpins our rights within the workplace. I think one of the things that has really struck us as Global Health 50/50, looking across the board and across the whole range of organizations that we look at, is how very infrequently organizations actually overtly recognize and put on paper what people's rights in the workplace are. And I'm old enough to think that part of that, it goes along with the almost virtual collapse of the trade union movement over the last 30 years, a movement that was specifically designed to remind all of us that this is not about discretionary organizational change. This is about us as individuals knowing our legal rights in the workplace. That's the bottom-up demand, and it's not a demand for change. It's a demand to ensure that our rights are realized. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, except, Sarah, that a major part of the trade union movement was incredibly sexy and did not go on the street for women's rights.
No, I completely agree.
So, there's different dimensions of that as well. And I think we have to openly discuss that. And maybe that's one of the reasons for the demise, because also they didn't really integrate women, equity, and unpaid work issues or issues of that nature. So even, progressive movements in quotes, also think of certain political parties, have not been that open to issues of women's leadership. I think, though, within organizations, I agree with you totally. You have to fight for your rights. And, I could spend an hour telling you the stories of my life in WHO in 16 years, and people consistently telling me, if you do this, if you ask for this, you're going to get fired, your contract's not going to be renewed. And I tell you, I did it, and none of that happened. None of that happened. And actually, I got another problem because people who did not have the courage to do that for whatever reason, I don't want to judge them, for whatever reason, suddenly didn't support me because I had been an example that you can be courageous, you can ask for things. So if one person starts doing that and something happens, it gets difficult for those who didn't ask for something before. So you're constantly in a situation of having to create alliances, of bringing people on, of saying, I'm not trying to show you up or anything. This is for all of us. If one of us makes this step, etc., etc. And so we have to be aware of these issues, and maybe also see who can take the risk and who can't. And there's a whole range of strategic and tactical issues. But, we have to ask for things. And, I started up and they gave me a payment grade, which was lower than if I'd been a man. And so I went into the regional director's office and said, I'm not accepting this, full stop. And the next thing I knew, I had the other grade. So, you really have to push wherever you are and try and build alliances to move it forward. And I think that's absolutely critical. And one thing around Madhu, all my mentors at WHO were men because there were no women around. Where were they? They weren't there. But the interesting thing was they were all men from the Nordic countries, where there had been an immense shift within society about how men see themselves and how they see others. And so we see how all these things interface, and how we have to fight on so many fronts. And that's why I talk so much about solidarity, because each individual that takes a risk wherever has to feel secure that she will find solidarity amongst others.
Thanks, Ilona. Wonderful insights and personal stories, which actually give a lot to us to be more active and more aggressive. We certainly are more privileged and we certainly have more women role models than it must have been 30 years back. I'll just quickly add and then probably conclude to, we've touched upon really important points here, and I underscore the solidarity and the equity focus and moving beyond human health. I also underscore learning from existing initiatives and ideas and concepts and the fights of the feminist ideas of building this movement, the joining hands with the decolonizing bit, and how we understand gender equality to be impacted by a lot of other discriminatory issues, and how we all can probably get together and learn from each other to build a movement for a more equal world than just working in silos again to only ask for gender rights or only ask for the rights of the disabled or only ask for the right of the migrants and so on. So a lot of merit in the collective action asking for a more equal world at large. Totally agree with the male allies, and whether we're going to work on that list, and we might just again get back to you for seeking suggestions, but we'll do our homework and get back to you. And by the next session, we should have that. Adding on the trade unions point bit, and then highlighting again that we at WGHI, and I'm sure at WGH overall, that we believe in the idea that the change has to be pushed from the top and facilitated from the bottom. So the change will come from the both sides, and we need to really enable that, if at all we feel a part of the movement here. We have a lot to learn from the trade unions for ASHAs and ANMs and how they have got together. I remember in India, we had this mass movement for auxiliary nurse midwives when they were asking for better salaries, and they got together to ask for those rights, and they actually got a better salary position. And we see a similar movement in history now for the ASHAs, the activists, for better incentives, and WGHI really draws a lot from their movements and their activism. There's not just inspiration, but also strategies of building solidarity with influential organizations, with the civil society organization, as well as working with the top leaders, identify partners, and uh, initiate the change, like we talked about, of getting the push from the trade unions, but having that one ally inside the organization to kind of shift those policies. We have examples from our recent nurse midwifery initiatives where we see a similar trajectory, and there's a lot to learn again from there. In India, we have a lot to learn from the feminist histories of ideas of the Dalit movements that we have, the Dalit women, and we draw a lot from that literature on asking for rights. But I'm concluding, I'm not going to take much time. Thank you all for joining, and please join us again in 20 minutes for our next session on Women in Global Health Chapter Journeys, where we'll be talking about the collective action of the Global Health family, Women in Global Health family, what we've done so far, what do we aim to achieve, and build the solidarity that we're talking about, and hopefully focus more on the equity and the equal health bit. Thanks for the audience for joining, and I, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank all the members of WGHI who helped put this together, for sticking together for a year in the most unusual times when all of us were pressed. And I hope to see more women in the next session. Thank you all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for joining. Thanks a lot.